Welcome to Telesur English. I am Estefania Bravo in Quito, Ecuador. This is from the south. In Venezuela, more than 2 million military personnel from the Bolivarian armed forces were deployed for the Bolivarian Shield 2020 civic military operation in the country. These exercises were called by President Nicolas Maduro and seek to reinforce the civic military union throughout the country. These events will be taking place throughout the weekend and look to strengthen the territorial defense of Venezuela against any external threat and in defense of the country's sovereignty. Meanwhile, Venezuela's Communications Minister Jorge Rodriguez announced the corruption network led by the country's opposition that has seized more than $116 million from the country.
We are suing Trump's administration in the present times because of the accounting of the theft of our assets, of our deposits in foreign banks, of our companies that are in border cities, of all our income that could have been generated if there was no financial blockade towards the imports that Venezuela needs, as they are doing at the moment. The companies that depend from the North American empire, which rises to $116 million, that is the accounted damage of the brutal act done by Trump's administration and the satellite governments and the Lakers that are here in Venezuela.
President Nicolas Maduro has been explaining Venezuela's decision to take its case against U.S. sanctions to the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Speaking to international media at the Miraflores Palace, President Maduro said that Venezuela had no other option but to seek international justice. He explained that for a long time, Venezuela has been demanding respect for international law and legality in the world. He said that the war being waged on Venezuela is an invisible economic war which harms the Venezuelan people as they seek medicine for chronic illnesses and other necessities.
I call on all the Venezuelan people to take very seriously, because the process against the United States in the ICC is a historic case. It's the defense of the right of the Venezuelan people to peace, to coexistence, to development. So what we want is justice. The ICC uses its capacity to order the suspension of the illegal coercive measures and penally punish those responsible for them, so that such things are not repeated.
President Nicolas Maduro gave a press conference with international media to talk about this. Let's have a look.
Venezuela has become a victim of one of the most cruel aggressions in history. Sanctions that have prevented Venezuelans from buying food, medicine, or to trade freely. It is for this reason that President Nicolas Maduro has presented a complaint before the International Criminal Court against the government of the United States. He is looking to defend the life, peace, and equality of the Venezuelan people.
It cannot be that every day. Every day, the government of the United States hounds, attacks, and prohibits the import of basic food necessities. That cannot be. This is a war, an invisible war that leaves more death than a visible war. This is an economic war, a structural war against the Venezuelan people, a criminal war.
For President Maduro, the coercive measures imposed by the United States violate the system of the UN Charter and international law. But despite these conditions, the Bolivarian government maintains its willingness to dialogue with the U.S. government.
I will always tell President Trump that the best way to resolve this conflict is through dialogue. And if he wants to hold a conversation with the one in charge of Venezuela, I am available to talk. But if you continue to say that you want to invade Venezuela, that you want to crush Venezuela, well then,
the president wants to create a space for divergent opinions in order to communicate the truth about Venezuela. He's also promoting the establishment of a group of countries allied to Venezuela to help facilitate the dialogue process in the lead-up to parliamentary elections coming up this year.
There's a dialogue process taking place currently with all political sectors of the country in order to give full guarantees for the upcoming parliamentary elections.
In Colombia, President Maduro maintained that his Colombian counterpart, Ivan Duque, broke all basic rules of international law and of understanding with Venezuela.
When a Colombian is going to confront Ivan Duque and tell him to stop, you need to respect Venezuela. When a Colombian is going to tell him to stop,
he also issued a warning to Brazilian authorities after evidence that the government of Jair Bolsonaro is behind the terrorist attacks against Venezuela.
Brazil needs to know that there are terrorist groups working from Brazilian territory, working against Venezuela. It's proven, and we have the right to defend ourselves.
President Maduro announced that this weekend, more than 2.5 million members of Venezuela's armed forces will be mobilizing during military exercises taking place in Caracas.
Moving on to Chile, protesters have continued to take to the streets despite demanding for social change despite heavy police repression. The protests that were initially sparked by an increase in the subway fares last October have turned into a broader movement demanding for reforms to health care, education, the pension system, and even the Constitution, which dates back to 1980 to the military dictatorship era. 31 people have died at the hands of security forces and more than 10,000 arrested since the protests began.
People say, why you go there? Is that I come to breed humanity, to breed union, to breed hope that the 118 days we have been coming to this, we have been here 119 days, since we realize everything. And as you can see, we are not faltering.
Moving on, Judge Beryl Howell has declared a mistrial in the case of 4 members of the Venezuelan Embassy Protection Collective after the jury was unable to arrive at a verdict. Activists Adrain Pine, David Paul, Kevin Cease, and Margaret Flowers were charged with interfering with certain federal protection functions or failing to vacate the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C. They faced a maximum sentence of a year in prison and a $100,000 fine. The 4 activists were arrested inside the Venezuelan embassy in May of 2019, which the activists have maintained was in a violation of international law. The Venezuelan government stated repeatedly that the activists were their guests and were there legally. Colombia's largest remaining guerrilla group, the ELN, has begun a 4-day armed stoppage, mainly in the northeast of the country. Hernan Tobar has the details from Bogotá.
Today, Colombia woke to an armed strike declared by the guerrillas of the National Liberation Army, or ELN. This action was called by the ELN throughout the country, but it is being felt mainly in the departments of North Santander and Arauca. Various communities and social movements in those areas are calling on the government and the guerrillas to restart peace talks, which were broken off at the beginning of last year. They want the government to open the way to such talks to prevent even more violence in the country. We should remember that there is a real humanitarian crisis in the Catatumbo region and in North Santander as a result of the permanent violence there. Many community leaders have been murdered, so they want a stable peace to return. The ELN's armed strike is scheduled to continue until Monday.
We'll take a short break now. Join us again after this. Welcome back to Campus Health. In Guatemala, Ecuador's organization leader CONAIE Jaime Vargas and coordinator of Guatemala's Campesino Committee Daniel Pascual were detained by police while walking on the street. According to local media outlets, the leaders had just left the Central Market when local police intimidated, followed, and tried to detain Vargas and Pascual. Ecuador's indigenous leader was in the country after an invitation from various social organizations. Daniel Pascual mentioned he felt worried about the detention calling it racist against indigenous people. The social leaders were eventually let go, and Vargas is currently flying back to Ecuador. Hundreds of human rights activists have demonstrated in Mexico against the violence on women. The protesters gathered in front of the Mexican presidential palace in Mexico City, calling on the government to investigate cases of women murders. The activists also demanded a probe into the recent murder of a young woman in the Mexican city. Meanwhile, the Mexican president Andrés Manuel López Obrador has assured that his government is concerned about the violence against women and warned that perpetrators will be accordingly punished. In Bolivia, Deputy Victor Bhava has accused the de facto's foreign minister Karen Longaric of being pro-Chile after the de facto government statements, saying that former President Evo Morales had supposedly admitted that Silala River was part of international watercourse. Bhava emphasized how serious these statements are and said he will file an inquiry to the foreign ministry to ask the basis of the statements.
For her to say, in the middle of the process, in an official communique of the foreign ministry, that the previous government had recognized that part of the waters of Sela was an international watercourse, even if he had. It's not about recognizing, it's about the facts. I invite you to go to Sela and see if it's a river of international watercourse. There are wells that are located in Bolivian territory. How is he able to do that? Isn't Chile going to use that as an argument to undermine our counterclaim? This is very serious. There can't be so much improvisation at international level. I'm currently going to file an inquiry to the foreign ministry so that they can tell us what's the motive, the basis for them to publish these types of communiques. We are in the middle of a legal process. We're going to file an inquiry to the foreign ministry for its declarations that, in my opinion, seem pro-Chilean declarations.
Bolivia's coup-ousted movement Towards Socialism party is preparing to launch its candidates in the Plan 3000 neighborhood of Santa Cruz. Freddy Morales has the latest from La Paz.
The movement Towards Socialism will hold its proclamation of candidates in a Plan 3000 neighborhood, one of the popular neighborhoods in the city of Santa Cruz. It's a challenge for the political movement, the most numerous in the country in the last 14 years, given that Santa Cruz was the cradle of the civic committee's coup which brought down the government, administered by this political party in November. The Plan 3000 neighborhood is one of the areas where the mass can expect large-scale support, but people are watching today's planned event, given that the Santa Cruz Civic Committee has its shock group, the Crucenistas, a youth union known for being violent and racist. This is another example of the extraordinary environment which these elections are being held under. There are 8 candidacies for the presidency. 7 of them are vying for office against the movement Towards Socialism. Following the November 10th coup, those political alliances, all conservatives, through judges and persecutors, began a legal witch hunt against mass leaders, members and critics of the de facto government. In the initial period of the coup alone, the de facto government People Ombudsman counted more than 90 people arrested, 50 of which are still faced with preventative detention. They have accused dissidents of terrorism, sedition, and are attempting to charge them for causing harm to the state economy. In recent days, new campaigns emerged with the aim of preventing the most important candidates of the movement Towards Socialism from running. On May 3rd, including Evo Morales, who is vying for the office of senator, and Luis Arce, the masked presidential candidate. Meanwhile, the Santa Cruz Civic Committee announced an indefinite strike if the Supreme Electoral Court is to allow Evo Morales to run.
We thank Freddy Morales for that report. The president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, delivered his 4th State of the Nation address in Parliament in Cape Town. This comes after a week of also celebrating 30 years since the release of former President Nelson Mandela. Let's have a look.
The president opened his address by reminding the nation about the words of Nelson Mandela, who was released 30 years ago this week.
He said, "Our march to freedom is irreversible. We must not allow fear to stand in our way. Close quotes.
The president said, now more than ever, we need to confront our challenges, as we too cannot allow fear to stand in our way. He acknowledged the current energy problems with ESCOM and announced some drastic measures to address the crisis.
We are taking the following measures to rapidly and significantly increase generation capacity outside of ESCOM. The Section 34 ministerial determination will be issued by the Minister of Energy, Mineral Resources and Energy shortly to give effect to the Integrated Resource Plan of 2019, enabling the development of additional grid capacity from renewable energy, natural gas, hydropower, battery storage, as well as coal.
The president also announced an increase in police visibility at tourist sites to make tourists feel safer.
What is exciting more, which a lot of our tourists are excited about, will be excited about, is the introduction of tourism police, which will be focused as in capacity from the police side supporting us. That is very exciting, and also to show that the importance of this is taken at the head of state level.
Members of the opposition described the president's speech as not bold enough.
Where the president fell short is that he didn't give himself a timeline to which he would stick to make sure that these events actually unfold. So it's really lovely to say that renewables are going to be added to the grid. It's really great to say that they're going to open the bid window, but you know, these bid windows and these energy supplies could be added to the grid as early as Monday if the political will was there.
Alliance partners welcomed the president's plans on education and addressing youth unemployment.
A commitment by government over the next 10 years of 64 billion rands, but also the president, as he is emphasizing, we use that to also raise another 64 billion rands from the private sector to forge a partnership to really crack. I think that over the next 10 years, we're really going to crack student accommodation such that at least we are able to actually accommodate sufficient numbers of students such that it will cease to become a big issue.
Some members pledged support and solidarity with the People's Republic of China on their fight against the outbreak of the coronavirus.
Cuba has sent virologists to China to go and assist the Chinese, which is an important expression of solidarity itself. And they don't count the fact that their doctors and scientists will contract the disease, but they will contribute towards saving humanity from an epidemic bigger than the SARS disease that we have seen a couple of years ago.
The president also paid tribute to the recently crowned Miss Universe Zozibini Tunzi and rugby Springbok captain Siya Kolisi of the victorious 2019 Rugby World Cup champions. The president called their achievements a reminder of our potential to achieve greatness against the odds. Johan Abrams for Telesur in Cape Town.
Brazil's currency, the real, continues to drop as Finance Minister Paulo Guedes starts to burn foreign reserves. Brian Muir has more from Sao Paulo.
As Brazil's currency reaches an all-time low against the dollar at 4.35 reais to the dollar, the Bolsonaro government has announced that it's going to start selling off more foreign reserves. Now, this foreign reserve issue is interesting because for years, the international media, the national media spread a huge misinformation campaign about the Brazilian economy, alleging that it had run out of money because of all the social spending during the PT years of Lula and Dilma Rousseff. In fact, when Lula took office in 2003, Brazil's foreign reserves were at around $38 billion. By the time Dilma was illegally removed from office in the parliamentary coup in 2016, Brazil had amassed $372 billion in foreign reserves, over R$1 trillion in national reserves, $240 billion in outstanding loans to the U.S. government, and around $20 billion of loans to the IMF, both of which were to be paid back with interest. So the fundamentals of the economy were solid, and it had been prepared to deal with a recession, to use reserves to buffer against the recession. But the coup government chose instead to pretend it was broke and to use this as an excuse to butcher public health, public education, to destroy the retirement system, and to destroy labor laws in Brazil. So now, after all of that, Finance Minister Paulo Guedes announced that he's going to free up another $1 billion of foreign reserves. Now, over the last year, they've spent nearly 10% of the reserves, and there's no sign that this is letting up. In 2019, they spent around $37 billion of the foreign reserves, and the rate is continuing. So at this rate, by the time they're done running the country, Brazil's going to be as broke as it was during the Fernando Henrique Cardoso administration, the exact opposite of what they promised.
We thank Brian Muir for that report. Welcome back to From the South. Egypt has confirmed its first case of the COVID-19 virus. World Health Organization, WHO Africa Region Director, Matshidiso Moeti confirmed the case, which is the first to be detected in Africa since the virus was first detected in Wuhan, the capital of Hubei province in central China, in December last year. It has so far killed almost 1,400 people and infected nearly 65,000 others globally. Meanwhile, ministers of the Economic Community of West African states have met in the Malian capital Bamako to discuss measures to strengthen the region's capacities in dealing with the COVID-19 outbreak.
Today we are leaving here really satisfied because we are going to develop plans. Of course, national responses that already exist in several cases. We are going to try to consolidate them into plans that could really enable us to have a coherent approach that could be financed at the regional level.
South Sudan President Salva Kiir has announced a key peace plan set to end the country's 6-year conflict. President Kiir said the country was reverting to the former 10-state system, which was a major demand from the country's opposition and the main cause of the conflict. Opposition groups in South Sudan welcomed the move and are set to meet with the president to finalize the new deal. The country was originally made of the 10 states, but the government later increased them to 32, a move which ignited fighting in Africa's youngest country.
This decision was reached by the presidency after weighing several options, and we thought this latest compromise will preserve the unity of the country and move the people of South Sudan out of this imposed, senseless conflict, which has affected the livelihoods of many of our citizens.
Israeli security forces have attacked a group of Palestinians who attempted to remove a barrier that blocked access to their village in the occupied West Bank. On Wednesday, Israeli soldiers erected barriers across several main and secondary roads of towns and villages to the north and west of city of Ramallah. Israel severely restricts Palestinians' freedom of movement through a complex combination of approximately 100 fixed checkpoints, mobile checkpoints, center-only roads, and various other physical obstructions. Hundreds of people have protested in the German city Munich against the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's ideals. The protest took place on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference, an annual gathering of world leaders to discuss security challenges, and they condemned the conference, describing it as a meeting of people obsessed with wars and arms dealers.
I want to demonstrate against the NATO Security Conference, and especially against this political tendency to spend more and more money on military security, instead of investing in social areas like healthcare and education.
And with that, we've come to the end of this news brief. You can find these and other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. And also join us on social media. We are on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Instagram. For Telesur English.